I always thought that if I ever caught my wife cheating, I'd walk out immediately, pack my things, slam the door, and never look back. But when the moment actually came, I didn't leave. No, I stayed. And that's how I knew I had truly won. Because she had no idea that from that second on, she wasn't living in her home anymore. She was living in my personal hell, and I was the devil holding the keys. It started with something small. A shift in the way she touched her phone, the way she turned it slightly away when a notification popped up. A pause before answering simple questions. A new perfume that she suddenly claimed she had always worn. I didn't explode. I didn't confront her. I simply observed. And then, one night, when she left for one of her girls' nights, the ones that had become strangely more frequent, I did what any calm, calculating man would do. I traced her. Not through some cheap private detective or dramatic scene outside a hotel room. No, I used technology, patience, and a level of self-control she never knew I had. She wasn't with her friends. She was with someone else. Some other man. And the most ironic part? I wasn't even angry. I wasn't heartbroken. I wasn't devastated. Those are emotional responses. And emotions cloud judgment. Instead, I felt something purer, something cleaner, an overwhelming sense of clarity. I saw the entire picture laid out before me. A marriage that was already over. A woman who thought she was smarter than me. A betrayal so deep it should have sent me into a blind rage. And yet, I just stood there, staring at my phone, watching the location pin of her betrayal blink on the screen, and I smiled. Because I had already made my decision. Leaving would have been easy. But easy meant she'd get to move on quickly. Easy meant she wouldn't feel the consequences of her choices. No, she needed to live in them. She needed to drown in the quiet, creeping horror of realizing she had destroyed her own world. And for that, I had to stay. Not as her husband, not as her partner, but as the specter of her own mistakes, haunting her every move. So I waited. When she came home later that night, makeup slightly smudged, the faintest trace of alcohol on her breath, she slipped into bed beside me as if nothing had changed. As if she hadn't just sold her soul for a few stolen hours of pleasure. I felt her body shift closer, her fingers brushing against my arm, testing if I was awake. I didn't react. I remained still, breathing evenly, letting her believe she had fooled me. Because that was the first step, making her feel safe in her lies. Over the next few days, I played my role to perfection. I kissed her before work, held polite conversations, laughed at all the right moments. But beneath the surface, I was reconstructing everything. I slowly started to erase her from my life while making sure she still believed she was in it. Bank accounts? Quietly separated. Joint assets? Moved. Passwords? Changed. Every piece of leverage she had over me was disappearing, and she had no idea. But that wasn't enough. That was just logistics. The real punishment had to be something more profound, something she'd feel. I became a ghost in my own home. I stopped initiating conversations, yet answered just enough to avoid suspicion. I ate dinner with her, but never made eye contact. I let her exist beside me, but never with me. And the silence? It was deafening. The first few days, she brushed it off. The next week, she started asking if everything was okay. And by the second week, she was begging for my attention. Is something wrong? She asked one night, her voice laced with fake concern. I looked at her, really looked at her, as if I were seeing a stranger in my home. Then, with the coldest smile, I simply said, "Nothing's wrong." "Why do you ask?" That's when I saw it, the flicker of fear behind her eyes. Not the fear of being caught, no. The fear of not knowing if she was caught. She was waiting for me to react, for me to explode, for me to accuse her. But I never gave her the satisfaction of certainty. Instead, I let the doubt rot her from the inside. Every time her phone buzzed, she glanced at me, waiting for my reaction. Every time she left the house, she hesitated at the door, as if expecting me to stop her. I never did. Because uncertainty is a much sharper blade than anger. She stopped going out as often. She started overcompensating, cooking my favorite meals, dressing up for me, initiating intimacy that I never accepted. And every rejection, every moment of cold distance, chipped away at her confidence. She was unraveling, doubting herself, doubting her decisions, doubting everything. But the real beauty of my revenge? She still had no proof that I knew. And that was the masterpiece. Because it meant she was destroying herself. Not because I yelled, not because I fought, but because I simply stopped caring. And the best part? This was just the beginning. If someone had asked me back then, I would have said my life was good. Maybe even great. Not perfect, because perfection is an illusion, but solid. Dependable. A life built on steady routines, small traditions, and the quiet comfort of knowing that at the end of the day, I had a home to return to, a woman who loved me, and a future that seemed as predictable as it was safe. Mornings were always the same. I woke up before her, slipping out of bed carefully so as not to wake her. She always slept on her stomach, one arm stretched over my side of the bed, her fingers sometimes curling around the fabric of my pillowcase as if to hold me there even in sleep. I liked that. It made me feel wanted, needed, chosen. I'd go to the kitchen, make coffee, black for me, a ridiculous vanilla caramel nonsense for her. She used to joke that my taste in coffee was as bitter as my soul, and I used to laugh. Back then, I thought it was funny. By the time she woke up, rubbing sleep from her eyes and mumbling something incoherent about needing 5 more minutes, her coffee would be waiting for her on the counter, the way she liked it. She always gave me this little sleepy smile, soft and affectionate, before taking her first sip. That was our routine. A quiet, simple thing. But now, looking back, I realize how much I had loved those little moments. We had dinner together every night. Nothing extravagant, sometimes home-cooked, sometimes takeout in front of the TV. She liked to lean into me when we sat on the couch, tucking her feet under her, stealing bites from my plate even when she had the same meal in front of her. "Yours just tastes better," she'd say with a grin, and I'd roll my eyes, pretending to be annoyed while secretly enjoying the small intimacy of it. Weekends were for grocery shopping, lazy mornings in bed, movie nights with a bottle of wine, and the occasional spontaneous road trip. She loved those. She always wanted adventure, something new, something exciting. I remember how her eyes used to light up when I'd tell her, "Let's just drive and see where we end up." She made me feel like the most interesting man in the world just by looking at me that way. I thought we were happy. Of course, there were signs. Not obvious ones. Not the kind that slap you in the face and scream, "She's cheating." No, they were smaller, quieter, so subtle that at the time, I brushed them off as nothing. But now, in hindsight, they stand out like neon warning signs I had been too blind to read. She started dressing up more. Not just for work, not just for nights out, but even on random errands. Suddenly, she cared about lingerie again, not for me, though. That part stings now. I remember the first time I noticed it. I made a casual joke about how she was putting in a lot of effort just to buy milk, and she laughed it off. "Can't a woman just feel good about herself?" she asked. And I agreed. Of course, she could. Why wouldn't I want her to feel beautiful? But now I know better. Then there was her phone. She had never been secretive before, had never cared if I glanced over her shoulder while she texted. But then, things changed. It started with small adjustments, the way she'd angle the screen slightly away, the way she'd pause before answering, as if deciding how much to say. I noticed it. I felt the shift, but I trusted her. I was a fool. Our conversations became shorter. Not in an obvious way, not in a way that raised immediate alarms. But she stopped asking about my day with real interest. Stopped really listening. Sometimes, I'd tell her something important, something that mattered to me, and a few days later, she'd completely forget we had even talked about it. That was new. That wasn't the woman I had married. And then, there were the girls' nights. At first, I didn't question them. She had always been social, had always valued her friendships. But the frequency increased. And she started coming home later. And then later. And then later still. Always with an excuse. Always just barely plausible enough to quiet the voice in my head telling me something was wrong. Looking back, I can't believe how much I ignored. How much I wanted to believe that everything was still normal. But the worst part? I wasn't some clueless, oblivious husband. Deep down, I felt it. The shift. The change in the air. But I loved her. And when you love someone, you lie to yourself. You rewrite the little details in your head, smooth over the rough edges, convince yourself that the unease you feel is just in your imagination. Until the moment comes when you can't lie to yourself anymore. The night I found out, everything froze. It was like the entire world had shifted on its axis, but somehow, I was the only one who noticed. And in that moment, something inside me snapped into place. Not in anger, not in sadness, but in clarity. She thought I didn't know. And that meant she had no idea what was coming next. It started with something small. Too small to be proof, but too big to ignore. I had just come home from work, later than usual. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't feel right. Normally, I'd hear her in the kitchen, humming absent-mindedly while cooking, or stretched out on the couch scrolling through her phone, waiting for me. But that night, silence. I stepped into the living room and saw her standing by the window, phone pressed to her ear. The second she saw me, she flinched, just a fraction of a second, but I caught it. Her body tensed, and her voice dropped, turning softer, quieter. I didn't hear what she was saying, just the tone. The tone was enough. Then she did something she had never done before. She ended the call the moment she realized I was watching. Not a casual, "I'll call you later," not a natural goodbye. Just a quick, clipped, "Yeah, okay," before hanging up. And then she turned to me with a bright, forced smile. "Hey, I didn't hear you come in." That was a lie. She had heard me. I wasn't exactly silent when I walked through the door. "Who was that?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. Not accusing. Just curious. She hesitated. A fraction of a second. Barely noticeable, but again, I caught it. "Emma," she said, too quickly. She was just telling me about her work drama. You know how she is. Another lie. I knew how Emma was. Emma was the kind of friend who hated talking on the phone. If she had gossip, she'd send a voice note or text, not have a hushed, secretive conversation at the window like a teenager sneaking a call past curfew. But I nodded. I didn't push. Not yet. She moved toward me, placing a light hand on my chest. A distraction tactic. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice suddenly too warm, too interested, like she was overcompensating. "Long," I said, still watching her, still reading every shift in her expression. "Yours." She shrugged, looking away. Looking away was new. "Same as always," she said lightly. "Nothing interesting. Nothing interesting. Except a secret phone call she didn't want me to hear." I let it slide, but my mind didn't. That was the first ripple in the surface, the first sign that the picture I had of our life wasn't as flawless as I thought. It wasn't a confession, wasn't solid proof, but it was something. And once you see something, you can't unsee it. After that, I started noticing more. Her phone, once casually left on the table or counter, was now always face down. She used to leave it charging in the kitchen overnight. Now, it stayed on her bedside table, clutched in her hand before she fell asleep. She started laughing at messages and not sharing them. We used to have this thing. Whenever one of us got a funny text, we'd read it out loud or show the other. But now, she'd glance at her phone, smile to herself, and then quickly lock the screen. I started keeping track. Not obsessively, not like some paranoid husband stalking his wife's every move. Just paying attention in a way I hadn't before. She was going out more. Not just girls' nights, but sudden errands, last-minute plans, things she never used to do. And always with just the right excuse, just the right level of casual detachment. The small lies piled up, each one minor enough to overlook on its own. But together, they painted a picture I didn't want to see. Then came the perfume. I remember the moment it hit me, clear as day. She came home late, again. She walked in, kissed me on the cheek, and headed straight for the shower. And that's when I smelled it. Not her perfume. Something else. Something unfamiliar. She always wore the same scent. Always. It was one of those little details I had come to associate with her, something I could recognize even in a crowd. But that night, when she leaned in to kiss me, it wasn't her scent. It was something heavier, muskier, more masculine. And I knew. I didn't say anything. Not that night. Not the next. Because knowing wasn't enough. I needed certainty. And once I had it, she would never see it coming. I had always believed that trust, once broken, could never be repaired. And yet, for the sake of clarity, for the sake of absolute certainty, I pretended. I played along. I watched her spin her web of lies with the same polite smile I had always worn, but now there was something different behind my eyes. Cold calculation. I stopped asking questions outright. Instead, I made observations. Questions can make a liar defensive, but silence? Silence lets them trap themselves. The first real crack appeared when she mentioned she was meeting Emma again. The same Emma who supposedly called her that night by the window. The same Emma who I knew, for a fact, was currently on a week-long vacation in another country. A simple lie, easily told, easily missed, unless you're paying attention. I nodded, even smiled. "Tell her I said hi," I said, and she did that thing again, the tiny hesitation, the half-second too long before replying. "Of course," she said, too brightly, as if overcompensating. I waited until she left before I checked Emma's Instagram. A quick scroll confirmed it. Emma was 2 time zones away, sipping cocktails on a beach. Lie number 1. Next, there was the car mileage. She had always been predictable in her routines: work, gym, errands, home. The distance between these places was consistent. But then, One evening, when she came home, I casually checked the odometer while pretending to grab something from the garage. The number was off. Not by much. Just enough to indicate a detour. I tested it. The next time she went out for groceries, I checked again when she returned. Another discrepancy. She wasn't just running errands. She was going somewhere else. Lie number 2. Then there was her phone. She had never been obsessed with privacy before, but now she was careful. Too careful. She used to leave it charging in the kitchen overnight. Now, it was always on her nightstand, screen down. She started taking it with her everywhere, even to the bathroom. And one night, while she was asleep, I tested something. I reached for her phone, just barely brushing my fingers against the screen. Nothing happened. Fingerprint lock. She changed her settings. I sat there in the dark, staring at the faint glow of the screen, and I smiled. Because that was the confirmation I needed. People don't change their passwords unless they have something to hide. Lie number 3. But still, none of this was proof. Not yet. I needed more. I needed something undeniable. So I started leaving traps. One evening, as she was heading out, I asked casually, "What time are you meeting Emma?" She blinked. A flicker of something guilt? Surprise, before recovering. 8. I nodded, watching her closely. Which restaurant? Another hesitation. Another shift of her weight. She never used to think about these answers. Now, she was calculating them. That Italian place downtown. I already knew she was lying. Emma was still out of town, and yet, I played along. I kissed her on the cheek and said, "Have fun." And then I followed her. Not in an obvious way. I waited 15 minutes, then got into my car and drove toward downtown. The Italian place she mentioned was easy to spot, small, cozy, with large windows. I parked across the street and waited. She never showed up. Lie number 4. So where was she? I started driving, thinking through the possible places she could have gone. And then, on a hunch, I checked a spot I had suspected for weeks, a hotel on the other side of town. Not a fancy one. Just discreet enough, just anonymous enough. And there, in the parking lot, was her car. I didn't need to go inside. I didn't need to see it with my own eyes. I already knew. But I wasn't angry. I wasn't heartbroken. I wasn't even surprised. Because this wasn't about emotion anymore. This was about the game. And now, I was winning. The moment of truth wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a screaming match, a public confrontation, or some Hollywood-style breakdown. No, it was quiet, calculated, chilling in its simplicity. Because when you already know the answer, the confirmation doesn't hit like a shockwave. It settles into your bones like a slow, creeping frost. I had followed her once. I had seen her car parked outside that hotel. But that wasn't enough. I needed undeniable proof. Something she couldn't twist, couldn't explain away, couldn't manipulate into sounding like anything other than what it was: betrayal. So I waited. And I prepared. The opportunity came 2 nights later. Another one of her last-minute plans. Another convenient excuse that no longer even bothered me. "I might be home late," she said, already slipping into her heels, fixing her lipstick in the hallway mirror. "Don't wait up." I smiled. "Of course. Have fun." She hesitated. Just for a second. She knew. Maybe not consciously, maybe not in a way she could articulate, but on some primal level, she felt the shift. The way my voice was just a little too calm. The way I wasn't asking questions anymore. She had been waiting for suspicion, for confrontation, but I had given her nothing. And that's what made her comfortable enough to be careless. The moment she left, I moved. I already had the tools. I had installed a GPS tracker under the bumper of her car 2 days ago. Nothing high-tech, nothing flashy, just a cheap little device that pinged my phone every few minutes. I watched as the dot moved across the map. Not downtown, not anywhere near the restaurant she had mentioned. Straight to the same hotel. It was almost funny. How predictable she had become. I gave her 20 minutes before I followed. Enough time for her to check in, get comfortable, feel safe. Enough time to let her dig her grave a little deeper. When I pulled into the parking lot, her car was exactly where I expected it to be. And right next to it, a black BMW. His. I didn't know who he was yet, but I would. That part didn't even matter. He was nobody. Just another man who thought he was winning something that was never his to begin with. I didn't bother sneaking around. I walked straight into the lobby, my heartbeat steady, my breathing even. The receptionist barely looked up as I approached the desk. "I need a key to room 214, I said, sliding a $100 bill across the counter. The man hesitated, eyes flicking to the money, then to me. I could see the internal battle playing out in his mind. Duty versus greed. Greed won. He took the cash, handed me a keycard, and looked away. It was almost too easy. When I reached the door, I didn't burst in. I didn't make a scene. I simply slid the keycard into the lock, heard the soft beep, and pushed it open. And there they were. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, still half-dressed, her blouse unbuttoned, her hair slightly tousled. Him, shirtless, smirking, relaxed, like this was just another Tuesday night. Like he had no idea that the ground beneath him was about to collapse. She gasped when she saw me. Guilt, shock, panic. He barely reacted. That part fascinated me. The way he simply raised an eyebrow, like I was the intruder here, like he was untouchable. I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me with a calmness that felt almost inhuman. "Don't stop on my account," I said, voice steady, devoid of emotion. I'd hate to ruin the moment. Her face drained of color. She scrambled off the bed, grabbing at her shirt, trying to button it up like that would somehow undo what had already happened. I can explain. I laughed. A genuine, cold laugh. "Can you?" She opened her mouth, closed it. Silence. Because what excuse could she possibly give? That this wasn't what it looked like? That she had tripped and landed on his lap? That they were just talking? I turned to him. "And you must be the famous Emma." He smirked. No shame, no remorse. Just another man who thought he had won. I stepped closer, watching as his confidence wavered just slightly. "You should leave," I told him, voice calm, almost friendly. "Before things get complicated." He held my gaze for a second longer, then glanced at her. No loyalty, no second thought, just self-preservation. He grabbed his shirt, his keys, and walked out without so much as a glance back. And then, it was just the two of us. She was crying now, whispering pathetic little apologies I didn't care to hear. "I didn't mean." "No," I interrupted. "You did." She sobbed harder. "It was a mistake." "No," I said again, firmer this time. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is burning dinner. What you did, that was a choice." She collapsed onto the bed, hands covering her face, shoulders shaking. I watched her for a long moment, feeling nothing. No anger, no heartbreak, just clarity. And then, finally, I spoke again. "I'm not leaving you," I said, voice almost gentle. Her head shot up, hope flickering in her tear-streaked eyes. I smiled. A slow, deliberate smile. "No," I repeated, softer this time. That would be too easy, because walking away would have meant freedom for her. A chance to rebuild, to move on, to forget. And she didn't deserve that. No, she was going to stay right where she was. And she was going to wish every single day that I had just walked away instead. I walked out of that hotel room without anger, without regret, without hesitation. She sat there on the bed, shaking, staring at me like a woman who had just realized she was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down, understanding, too late, that the ground beneath her was already gone. But I didn't push her. Not yet. That would have been too easy, too obvious. And easy wasn't what I was after. No, she had spent months, maybe longer, building her little world of lies, constructing a safe illusion where she could have me, her stable, dependable husband, and him, her thrill, her escape, her secret. And she thought she could keep it all, thought she could balance it like a game, never paying the price. She was wrong. Now, I was going to make her watch as I dismantled it, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. I spent the next few days in silence. Not the kind that invites conversation, not the kind that hints at reconciliation, the kind that feels like a countdown. I let her sit in her own paranoia, let her feel the weight of uncertainty pressing against her chest. She didn't know if I would leave. She didn't know if I would explode. She didn't know anything. And that was the point. Because uncertainty is a slow poison, and I wanted her to drink every last drop. But silence was only the beginning. The real work started with her reputation. She thrived on appearances. She wasn't just anyone. She had a carefully curated image, a public version of herself that she had polished to perfection. The devoted wife, the charming friend, the woman who could do no wrong. She had built herself a pedestal, and I was going to pull it out from under her, so subtly, so masterfully, that she wouldn't even realize she was falling until she hit the ground. I started small. Conversations with friends. Casual remarks, said in just the right way, in just the right tone. Not accusations, just enough to plant seeds of doubt. "She's been acting different lately," I'd say with a thoughtful expression. I think she's been under a lot of stress. I let them fill in the blanks. People love to connect the dots on their own. It makes them feel clever. I just had to make sure the dots were there. Then came the social shift. I distanced myself, subtly but noticeably. At gatherings, I stood apart. At home, I stopped reacting to her presence. And people noticed. They always do. But the real beauty of it? She couldn't say a word. Because the moment she tried to explain, to defend herself, was the moment she would have to admit what she had done. Then, I went for the financial hit. Quietly, methodically, I began shifting our assets. Every shared account, every joint investment, I untangled from her grasp. I had already started this process the moment my suspicions arose. But now, I was precise. Ruthless. By the time she realized what was happening, it was already done. Money that had been ours was now mine. Future plans, trips, purchases, investments, canceled or reassigned. She still had her income, of course, but her safety net was gone. And worse, she had no idea how. The best part? I never accused her, never confronted her, because that would have given her closure, given her the chance to fight, to argue, to justify. I gave her nothing, just a slow, creeping sense of loss, a feeling that her world was coming apart at the seams and she couldn't figure out why. And just when she thought it couldn't get worse, I played my final move. Him. I had found out who he was easily enough. A married man. Of course, it was almost cliché, but I didn't need to tell his wife, not directly, at least. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I let the truth find its own way. A forgotten item left in his car. A well-timed message from a wrong number. Little things, invisible fingerprints of guilt, until finally, the inevitable happened. His wife put the pieces together herself. And when she did, she burned everything down. It took 2 weeks. 2 weeks for her world to collapse in slow motion. The whispers among friends turned into distance. Invitations dried up. Her finances, once stable, became strained. And her affair? Gone. He was too busy dealing with his own personal disaster to play her game anymore. She tried to talk to me one night, sitting across from me at the dinner table like a stranger in her own home. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, eyes pleading. I set down my fork, met her gaze with a calmness that must have terrified her. "I'm not doing anything," I said simply. And that was the truth. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't fought. I hadn't laid a hand on her or destroyed her things. I had just stopped protecting her. Stopped shielding her from the consequences of her own choices. Stopped holding together the fragile illusion she had built for herself. And without me to reinforce the walls, her perfect little world had crumbled on its own. And now? Now, she was exactly where she deserved to be. Alone. She thought she was getting away with it. Thought she had me fooled, or at least believed she could fix it before everything slipped through her fingers. But the beauty of my plan wasn't just that it was destructive, it was that she had walked straight into it, thinking she still had control. It was time to finish what I started. I chose my moment carefully, not in a rage, not in the heat of confrontation. That would have given her an escape, a way to turn things into a messy, emotional spectacle where she could play the victim. No, I needed precision. I needed an audience. And most importantly, I needed to make sure that every single person who mattered to her was there to witness it. Our anniversary was coming up. We had planned a dinner weeks ago, before I uncovered the truth. A small, intimate gathering with our closest friends, her family, colleagues. She had insisted on it. She wanted to show off our strong marriage, keep up appearances. And that was the moment I knew. This was it. This was where I would end it. I let her believe everything was fine. I played the part of the forgiving husband, the man who was willing to look past her mistakes. She ate it up. She started trying again, acting affectionate, holding my hand, slipping into bed beside me as if the past few weeks hadn't been a slow, steady descent into her own ruin. But what she didn't know was that this was her funeral. The night of the dinner, I was the perfect host. I greeted our guest with a smile, shook hands, laughed at small talk. She was radiant, basking in the attention, convinced that she had won me back. She kissed my cheek when she thought people were watching, never realizing I had orchestrated every detail of this night to destroy her. Halfway through dinner, I stood up, raising my glass. "A toast," I said, smiling as the room quieted. She beamed at me, still unaware of the knife hovering over her throat. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," I continued. "Marriage, as we all know, is about trust, about honesty, about building a life together, knowing that no matter what, you always have your partner's back." A few people nodded, lifting their glasses. She reached for mine, clinking it gently, still playing the role of the devoted wife. I turned to her, locking eyes. And so, tonight, I wanted to take a moment to celebrate not just our love, but also the beautiful memories we've shared and the incredible people who have been part of our journey. I reached into my pocket, pulling out a small envelope. Her expression changed. Not dramatically, just the slightest flicker of confusion, quickly masked with another bright, forced smile. I held up the envelope. I thought, what better way to celebrate our years together than by sharing some of those moments with everyone here? I slid a USB drive from the envelope, walking over to the TV mounted on the wall. I put together something special. Her breath hitched. I could feel the tension radiating off her as I plugged in the drive, as the screen flickered to life. I had waited for this moment, planned for it. And now, as the first images filled the screen, I saw the exact second she realized what was happening. At first, it was just us. Smiling photos, trips, little video snippets of our life together. The perfect couple. The perfect illusion. But then the shift. A screenshot of her messages. Her conversations. Her telling him how much she missed him. How she wished she could see him more. How she loved sneaking around. The room went silent. Another image, the hotel receipt. Another, GPS data from the night she was out with friends. And then the final blow. A photo. Blurry, grainy, but unmistakable. Her, with him. In the hotel parking lot. The silence was deafening. She gasped, a sharp intake of breath, a sound of pure horror. What is this? She stammered, voice shaking, hands trembling on the table. I turned to her, calm, collected, prepared. This, I said, tilting my head slightly. Oh, this is just a little compilation of the truth. Her mother was gaping at her, hands covering her mouth. Her father? Frozen in place, jaw clenched. Friends, colleagues, every person who had ever admired her, respected her, watching as her carefully constructed world collapsed in real time. She shot up from her seat. This is out of context. I laughed. Actually laughed. Out of context? I repeated. Then by all means, explain it to us. She looked around, realizing there was no escape. No lie that could cover this, no excuse she could weave to undo what had just happened. I let the silence stretch. Let her feel the weight of every judging stare, every shattered illusion. Then I turned back to her guests. Well, I said, swirling the last sip of wine in my glass. I think that about sums up our anniversary, don't you? And with that, I walked out, leaving her to drown in the mess she had made. I didn't stay to watch her world collapse. I didn't need to. The moment I walked out of that dinner, I knew exactly what was happening behind me. The stunned silence, the whispers turning into murmurs, the shifting eyes of friends and family who had just witnessed a car crash in real time. And her panicking, scrambling, trying to piece together an explanation that would make sense, that would somehow erase what everyone had just seen. But there was no erasing it. No coming back from this. I took my time, drove around the city, letting the cool air settle over me like armor. No anger, no heartbreak, just a deep, satisfying calm. I had spent weeks, maybe longer, drowning in the weight of her betrayal, suffocating under the lies. But now, she was the one gasping for air. By the time I returned home, the house was dark, except for the faint glow coming from the living room. She was waiting. I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me. The moment she saw me, she stood up too quickly, nearly knocking over the glass of wine she had been clutching with shaking hands. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and red-rimmed. She had been crying. Good. Her voice cracked, so she swallowed and tried again. You embarrassed me. I let out a quiet chuckle, shaking my head as I walked past her, unbothered, heading to the kitchen to pour myself a drink. Embarrassed you? I repeated, as if the concept was foreign to me. That's an interesting way to phrase it. She followed, desperation seeping into every step, every breath. You didn't have to do it like that, she pleaded, voice trembling. We could have talked. Just us. We could have it. I turned to her, leaning against the counter, taking a slow sip of my drink. Talked? I echoed, raising an eyebrow. Like the way you talked to him? Or do you mean the way you talked to me every time you lied about where you were? She flinched, arms wrapping around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. It wasn't working. Her lips parted, then closed again. She was searching, grasping for something to say that would make this go away. But there was nothing left to say. I didn't mean to hurt you, she whispered finally. I made a mistake. I let the silence hang between us, watching as she squirmed under the weight of it. And then, finally, I spoke. Calm. Cold. Final. No, I said. A mistake is forgetting an appointment. A mistake is sending a text to the wrong person. What you did was a choice. Over and over again. She choked on a sob, shaking her head violently. It wasn't like that. You don't understand it. I set my glass down on the counter with a soft clink. Oh, I understand perfectly, I said. I understand that every time you kissed me, you had already kissed him. Every time you looked me in the eye, you had already lied. And every time I trusted you, you were laughing behind my back. Her legs wobbled beneath her, and she reached for the counter to steady herself. I didn't move to help. You were everything to me, she whispered, tears streaming freely down her face now. I never wanted to lose you. I tilted my head slightly, studying her like a stranger. Then maybe, I said, voice like ice, you should have thought about that before you threw it all away. The sob she let out was raw, broken. Good. Let her feel it. Let her drown in it. I can fix this, she gasped, stepping closer. I didn't move. We can fix this. Please. Just tell me what I need to do. I laughed softly, shaking my head. You still don't get it, do you? I said, meeting her gaze. There's no we anymore. There hasn't been for a long time. You ended that the moment you decided I wasn't enough for you. She covered her mouth with a trembling hand, as if trying to hold in the sound of her own despair. I pushed off the counter, walking past her toward the stairs. She turned quickly, watching me with wide, desperate eyes. Where are you going? I paused at the bottom step, glancing back at her. To bed. Her breath hitched. What does that mean? I exhaled slowly, as if explaining something painfully obvious. It means, as of right now, I'm done talking to you. Her body jerked as if I had struck her. You can't just. I can, I said simply. And I am. She took a step toward me, hands outstretched, but I held up a finger, stopping her in place. Don't, I warned, voice dangerously low. You don't get to touch me anymore. Tears streamed down her face as she finally understood. This wasn't a fight. This was the end. Not with screaming, not with a dramatic exit, not with words that would be thrown back and forth until they lost their meaning. Just silence. Just finality. I turned, walking up the stairs without looking back. Behind me, I could hear her crumple onto the floor, sobbing, gasping, breaking apart. And for the first time in a long time, I slept peacefully. The aftermath was not immediate. It never is. Ruin doesn't come in a single, explosive moment. It unfolds like a slow-moving avalanche, gaining speed, swallowing everything in its path. And I watched it all happen, just as I planned. She tried, of course. At first, she tried to control the damage. She reached out to her family, to our friends, spinning desperate narratives about how it wasn't what it looked like, about how we could work through it. But there was no one left to believe her. The dinner had been too public, the evidence too damning. People may be willing to overlook rumors, but not proof. The faces that once smiled at her, admired her, now turned away. Invitations stopped. Calls went unanswered. The same people who used to hang on to her words no longer wanted to hear them. Her parents were the worst. They had always seen our marriage as something to be proud of, something solid, something respectable. And now it was a disgrace. Her father, a man of quiet but firm principles, refused to speak to her. Her mother, devastated, could barely look at her. She had shamed them. In their eyes, she had thrown away the life they had hoped she would have. And for what? A fleeting indulgence? A lie that unraveled too easily? She had gambled everything and lost. At work, things didn't fall apart immediately, but the cracks were there. She had built her reputation on being put together, polished, trustworthy. The woman who could handle everything, whose personal life was as impeccable as her professional one. But whispers spread. They always do. She still had her job, but she no longer had the same respect. There were side glances during meetings, hushed conversations that stopped the moment she entered the room. She was no longer the woman people confided in. She was the cautionary tale. Her lover? Gone. The moment his wife found out, his life crumbled faster than hers. A brutal divorce. A custody battle. His name dragged through the mud. He had no time for her, no patience, no comfort to give. He was fighting for survival, and she was nothing more than a mistake he regretted. And me? I thrived. I wasn't just free. I was untouchable. My finances were intact. Hers were a mess. The house? Mine. I had prepared for this, had quietly ensured that when the time came, I wouldn't just leave, I would leave with everything. I moved on quickly and visibly, took care of myself, focused on my work, traveled, lived. And people noticed. They saw the contrast. She was struggling, fading into the background, while I was thriving, standing taller than ever. I ran into her once, months later. She looked smaller. Not physically, but in presence. The woman who once walked into a room expecting admiration now avoided eye contact. She tried to speak to what? Apologize again? Make excuses? I wouldn't know. Because I just walked past her, without a word. Because there was nothing left to say. I had already won. I never spoke to her again. Never answered her messages, never acknowledged her presence when I saw her in passing. She had become nothing more than a ghost, a shadow of the woman she used to be, trapped in the ruins of the life she destroyed. And that was the best part. I didn't need to scream at her. I didn't need to curse her name. My silence was punishment enough. She knew what she had lost. She knew that no matter what she did, she could never rebuild what she had burned to the ground. But the real question isn't what happened to her. It's what happened to me. Because here's the thing. I didn't just survive. I thrived. People expected me to fall apart. Maybe she did too. Maybe, in her mind, I was supposed to be shattered, broken, drowning in regret. But I was never the weak one. She was. She was the one who had everything and still went searching for more. She was the one who couldn't handle the weight of real commitment. She was the one who lost everything, not me. And when people ask me if I regret how I handled it, if I regret staying long enough to make sure she felt every ounce of pain she deserved, I tell them the truth. No, not for a second. Because in the end, I didn't just walk away. I made sure she understood exactly what she had done. I made sure she knew that the worst part of losing me was knowing she could never get me back. And now I ask you, what would you have done in my place? Would you have walked away the moment you found out? Would you have confronted her, screamed at her, demanded explanations? Or would you have done what I did, waited, planned, and made sure she felt every consequence of her betrayal? Because if you ask me, there is no greater revenge than watching someone realize, too late, that they destroyed the best thing they ever had.